Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'll be talking about this camera right here. It's the Nikon D80. Now this camera has been out for quite a while now, I know, way back around the year 2006 I believe it was, simply because it was almost a year after this was released. So yeah, the D200. I'll be talking about this camera as well later on in the video, though not really, directly comparing it, but since a lot of people like to compare it because of the resolution, I will also be touching it later on in the video as well. But in this video, I'll just be focusing on, my thoughts on this camera based on how I use it and why I still recommend it and why I might not recommend it to some of you. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Nikon D80, despite being such an old camera at this point, it is still a very capable camera to use, and also personally a very fun camera to use as well. It's very simple. It's a photography first camera. It doesn't have any video modes, don't worry. But it is also such a nice and light camera to just take it anywhere with you and still capture that, random moments. And for its credit, like, it still is able to just deliver clean and good enough images if you just want to print it out at A3 or A2 size, or just want to, let's say, post it up on your social media accounts like your Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, what have you. So yeah, there is that. And being a really just photography centric camera and also a very basic camera, it also means it's a camera that you can just focus on your shots and not be distracted by any other features or gimmicks that this camera could have offered. So yeah, there's that. And just like in any of my other My Thought videos, I'll be dividing this video into 3 different sections. The first one is going to be about the ergonomics and the usability, then leading down into the image quality, and then into the conclusion, what I think about this camera and why I might and might not recommend it. So let's first start with the ergonomics and the usability. This camera, despite being kind of like an entry-level camera, but it was more of like their higher end entry-level camera, because there's also this top LCD screen that I really much love, because when shooting outdoors, it's always nice to just have your settings visible on top of the camera. Then you always know what you're shooting and things like that. And to be honest, all of the essential, well, most of the essential settings and values are actually up here. What's not always up here is your ISO, so I find that actually kind of annoying. I wish that the ISO would be here at all times as well. So I wish they could just improve on that, but it is what it is. It is still a very useful feature to have, just this top LCD screen. Anyway, while we're on the top, the next obvious point is obviously the flash. Now this camera has quite a nice tall flash and further back away from the lens. If you're into shooting portraits with built-in flashes, having such a high-rise flash and a bit further away from the lens means that there's a less chance actually on getting that red eye effect. So that's actually pretty good. But when you do get that red eye effect, it's also not that hard to remove them later on in post. It just takes you like, what, 2 seconds, and that's that. And while we're still on the top, let's move to the next point, which is the button layout. Actually, the button layout on this camera is all very nicely laid out, very logical, and also just, yeah, especially if you're coming from the Nikon system anyway, you will be very at home with the button layout of this camera. The only downside about the button layout of this camera is, well, it's not really the button layout per se, but it's actually the print ink used on these buttons, because it's actually fading, to be honest with you. And that's something that I noticed on, let's say, the D200, on the D40, the D70, the D70S. Those older Nikon cameras in general, they all have very bad ink on these cameras that after a long period of time, the ink that was printed on these cameras would start to fade. And of course Nikon fixed that with the D700, D800, things like that. So yeah, but just to keep in mind that these cameras, after a while of using, the ink will slowly fade away, and that is just a minor I wouldn't say quirk, but a minor kind of nitpicking. Yeah. Anyway, then onto the side, If you're into shooting with remote, there is a separate neat little compartment for the remote. Otherwise, the rest of the port will just be shared with your DC in, USB, and video out. Let's say, well, it doesn't shoot video, but if you want to, let's say, show a slideshow of your images onto your television for your family to see, there is the video port. So there is that. Moving on to the other side, you'd have the SD card slot. Unfortunately, well, for me it's unfortunate. I know that a lot of people love SD card. I would very much prefer CF card because SD cards fail very often. Yeah, regardless of brands, apart from Lexa. Anyway, moving on to the next point, because that previous point would actually stir a lot of heat. The viewfinder on this camera is actually quite small for what I'm used to, but it will get the job done, and you will not have that like really severe tunnel vision. There is a bit of tunnel vision in here, but it's not too severe. But what I really love about the viewfinder in here is that you can actually enable the grid, which I actually have enabled the grid. Now this camera is way too old for and also way too low end for Nikon to implement the leveling in the viewfinder. So having the grid enabled in here actually will help you to frame your images more balanced, especially if you're standing in an awkward position where your balance could be, you know, interrupted or influenced. Then it's always nice to just rely on the grids inside the viewfinder. And while we're talking about the viewfinder, there's like this 11, I believe, autofocusing points in there. To be honest, it's more than enough to just photograph the general field of photography, because you're not going to be shooting super fast action with this autofocusing points. It is slow, but it is accurate, assuming the lighting condition is good out there. That being said, if there is either too dark condition, or if the condition outdoor is too, or anywhere is too highly contrasted, then the autofocusing points can be inaccurate for the most part. It can just be like almost in focus, and it could seem like it's in focus in the viewfinder, but really it's just like a hair away from being fully in focus, so that is a bit annoying. But if you know that, you can always work around, just focus and recompose. There is that. Another thing that I don't really like about this camera is the metering system. The metering on the system, well, in this camera, is actually not really accurate. So of course it's an old camera, you kind of expect that. But if you're shooting a lot, let's say in the urban area where there's a lot of contrast, or if you're shooting a lot in the forest or at the park where there's too much green, or if there's too much unpredicted patterns in the forest or in the park, then it will really influence the metering in here to be inaccurate. So that is something to look out for. So for example, when I'm shooting in the urban environment, where there are a lot of buildings, a lot of really high contrast areas, things like that, I find myself having to overexpose by a third of a stop. Whereas if I'm in the forest where there's so many greens and also so many complex patterns for the camera to just try to recognize, I find myself having to underexpose by around 1 stop or 1 1/3 of a stop. So yeah, it's not very accurate. But for just general purpose of photography, it's definitely perfectly okay. The white balance is also a little bit off in some cases, but I do shoot raw, so I don't really mind. So there is that, but for some people, they might find it as like a turn off if it's just inaccurate in most cases. You just have to get used to it and then work around it, because once you get used to it, you will know its limitations and you will be able to program everything before you actually take the shot anyway. But just a heads up before, you know, you go out there and just shoot everything in auto. So there is that. Otherwise, yeah, there's not really much else to say apart from this camera can actually shoot up to 3 frames per second, which was actually quite a standard for the time. But for nowadays, it is, well, it's not really fast, to be honest with you, but it will get the job done in the general field of photography. You can shoot your kids' football game, or you can shoot your event photography, your wedding photography, your simple portrait photography, food photography, what have you. It will get the job done, but don't expect anything extreme out of it. So yeah, there's that. Now over onto the menu side of things. The menu on this camera, being a photography first camera and also being a basic camera, the menu is actually very nice, very minimalistic, and also very logically arranged, which is something that I really like, because you don't want to be out there, you know, fiddling through the menu and spending like 2 or 3 minutes on the menu when you really only want to be spending less than 5 seconds or less than 10 seconds on the menu, because you know you could actually miss your shots and it could be too frustrating to just change certain things again. So it's very nice to have a very clean layout and also a very logically laid out menu as well. So that is actually quite nice, and because it's very clean, very logically arranged, and also very minimalistic, it means that you'll just have more concentration and focus on the shots. So yeah, and talking about shots, let's now dive into the image quality. The image quality of this camera, well, it's nothing new. It's 10 megapixels, really, and it's also CCD sensor. A lot of people really love CCD sensors, and I can see why. I personally am a huge fan of CMOS sensors rather than CCD sensors, but the character that you'll get out of these cameras are actually quite nice. Though, even though I think they're the same sensor, but with how Nikon programmed the colors to be, I prefer the color slightly better out of the D200. But if you're just talking about the details, there's practically or virtually no difference, especially for today's standards, the details between the D80 and the D200. That being said, I wouldn't really go over ISO 800 on this camera because you will start to see a lot of noise. That being said, if you're only focusing on posting the images on Instagram, Facebook, what have you, 10 megapixels is a lot. So when you do see noise, you can always trade in the resolution in post to have a cleaner image. So yeah, there is that. But what you'll have to watch out is this camera will definitely not have the dynamic range of the D800 or the D700. So just watch out where you're shooting, because once there's highlights or like extreme highlights and extreme shadows, it's really hard to recover those details, and you might have to either bracket or just ignore the scene in general. So yeah, keep that in mind. And also, being an old camera, moire and aliasing is real. Do watch that out as well. So when you're shooting anything with super fine details, super fine patterns, just watch out for moire and aliasing. It will pop up as well at some point. So yeah, otherwise the color depth, the color information, the color science is pretty nice out of this camera, and it also produces a file that you can really just do some basic manipulation with, so that's actually quite nice. It's also quite robust as well, aside from the low light situation. Otherwise the files is actually very robust, so that's actually quite nice. Now leading into the conclusion, this camera for under 50 euros, under 40 euros, I would actually highly recommend it, simply because it is such a fun camera to use. It is quite light, it is, yeah, an enjoyable camera to really use. If you want to learn about the basics of photography, this camera will also teach you that, yet still delivering at a decent quality of 10 megapixels, leaving you just enough room to just crop in a little bit if you want to post your images later like on Instagram, Facebook, or just other social media platforms. So yeah, and it's like 3 frames per second is also not too slow, but we'll just get the general field of photography covered. And also it allows you to just think about what you're going to capture, because rather than having so many fancy features like modern cameras or even cameras from 8, 9, 10 years ago, this camera is just a bare bone photography camera. So you'll just be focusing on the conceptualization part of the images rather than on the super technical side or the gimmicky side of the photography with this camera. And I would like to actually just briefly touch upon the D200 as well, because they are in such a, you know, similar price range. I got this for under 40 euros and I got this for exactly 40 euros. They both have the same megapixel count, but you know, in the very beginning, to me it was a no-brainer to just go with the D200, because for me, having a camera that has no weather sealing is a huge deal breaker, and this has no weather sealing. But in the same time, I also get why these two cameras really exist today and why people are really debating between these two cameras despite having such a similar price point. So with this camera, I feel like I enjoy shooting this camera more as like a snap camera, like just go out there and just snap the shots. Whereas with this camera, I know, like every time I go out with this camera, I know what I want to shoot with this camera kind of feel. And I love the ruggedness, I love the weather sealing, I love the build quality, I love how it feels in general. And I just love this camera more, just to be transparent, than the D80. But with the D80, it's just an easy camera and it allows me to feel careless with photography. And that's the fun side of photography as well. And I feel like if you just want to go out there and take good images and still learn photography and have a cheap camera that if it breaks you can replace it at any time without feeling too bad for it, then this camera is also a nice camera, a nice option to go for, and also a camera that allows you to not only learn photography but just to stay focused in photography while shooting with it. So yeah, that has been it for this video. It's not all of the points I wanted to talk about, but pretty much most of my main points have been made in this video, and I hope that it actually helps some of you guys out there, if not a lot then a little. But yeah, anyway, if you need a free photography guidebook absolutely for free, it's on my website. Just click the link down in the description section below. It's for free. You don't need to submit your email address, nothing. Just click and download, and I will not bombard you with any newsletter nonsense, don't worry. And also on my website there's also my new photography courses out there as well, video courses if you want, like, well, video photography courses, if you want to watch those. And also if you have any questions, any suggestions, any stories to share, any experience to share, feel free to also just comment those down in the comment section below as well. Otherwise, I thank you all very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Till next time, bye for now.